You ready?
Yep.
Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Southampton University's webinar on fighting food waste for a sustainable future. And through this, we're going to talk about food waste and how we can all play our part within this. Now, for this session, you have a team of people from the School of Geography and Environmental Science. You have me, I'm Pete. I'm the director of the Environmental Science Group, and I have a strong interest in food waste. We also have my colleague, Dianna Smith, who's here. She's also within our school, and she works on food security. And we also have two students who are current BSc Geography students here to help as well. So we have Gracie and Fatima. Gracie does quite a lot outside her formal studies, so she's involved in social entrepreneurship and leads one of the projects through Anaxis. Fatima is the Sustainable Officer for the Southampton University Students' Union. So what we're going to do for this is start off with a webinar, so a presentation on food waste and sustainability. So through that, you'll hear various contributions from me and Dianna, and we'll also have some case studies and examples running through the presentation that Gracie and Fatima are going to speak about as well. Now, this will be interactive as well, so there's plenty of opportunity to ask questions and answers during this session. So we've got some time after the main webinar for discussion, and there's also a chance to interact with this and contribute to the materials that we generate. So there's also a Q&A tab here. So if you look at the top of your screen, it'll say Q&A. If you have any questions to ask the team, you can put those up, post those, and then we can answer those as we go through the presentation, and any that we can't pick up during the presentation itself, we can talk about in the question and answer sessions afterwards. Okay, so that's how it's all going to work. So hopefully this should be interesting. It's certainly very, very important to consider this. And we're also hoping to give you some ideas about the kind of things that you might focus on in due course should you pursue a degree in a subject like geography or environmental science. Okay, so next slide. What we're going to deal with in this session is to start off with some big picture facts and figures. We're going to look at the impacts of food production. We're going to look at the links with climate change. We're going to look at the reasons why we waste food and the types of food that we waste as well. And then importantly, we're going to focus on making a difference. What can we actually do, and what does this do that's positive? We'll link this with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as well, so we can look at that big picture of the kind of things that we're dealing with, the problems that we're addressing at global scale. Now, the interactive part of this will run something through Mentimeter. I don't know if anyone's used before, but it's a way of generating word clouds. So what we have for this is a Mentimeter site. You can either go to that using the website address just there, or we've got a QR code that you can scan direct from your screen. So the idea of this is to get your ideas as well and get some of your input to this talk, so we can make it move forward and use that as the basis for discussion. Now, first thing we're going to do is wade straight in and think about the kind of impacts that food has on the environment. So for this, we'll start off with a relatively simple, easy example, and we'll look at starches in our diet. So starches are important, really important form of energy for us, and it's one of those essential food groups that we need. So 4 common types here. Think about bread, potatoes, pasta, and rice. Now, which one of those 4 would you think has the biggest impact, the biggest contribution to climate change? So this is where you can scan the QR code and go into Mentimeter. And if you go direct through the website, then put the number in, and there will be a list of bread, potatoes, pasta, and rice to select. So while you're doing that, just a few more words about the broad impacts. So this is one of several different food groups. And of course, what we eat is really, really massively important to us. The choices that we make about the food we eat have impacts on our personal health and well-being. And of course, because this food is produced in different ways with various impacts on the environment, which we'll talk about in a few more minutes in more detail. And those choices make a big influence on how our food choices affect the environment and can even affect global scale processes. So hopefully you've all had a go at Mentimeter. Yes, it's working. Brilliant. So
yes, 10 answers so far, Pete, out of an expected 11. So that's a good response rate. Thank you very much, everyone. Oh, all 11 now. So hopefully you can see the results here. And what has come in top but rice. So tell me, Pete, how does that match up with what we know it should be? So we've got rice first, and then 18% said pasta had the greatest impact. No one thought potatoes, and we've got probably one person who answered bread. So looking at that, how does that match up with what we actually see in reality? I'm just going to switch back to the PowerPoint presentation now and move ahead.
okay, so it looks like we've got a pretty good match here. If we look at the impacts, so these are data in carbon dioxide equivalents per serving, and what you've identified through the Mentimeter is exactly right. So that rank that you have from rice down to pasta, down to bread, and then potatoes fits exactly with published work. There's quite a few different estimates for this, so numbers vary, but time and time again, we see this same pattern. So instantly, what we can see here is that the choices that we make about our food make a big difference in terms of the impacts. So if we all eat lots and lots of rice, good reasons, then it has a big impact, a bigger impact than eating bread or potatoes. So those food choices make a really, really big difference. Now, if we look at the next slide, we've got an idea here about the kind of impacts that we see from our food production. So it's not just about greenhouse gases in isolation. When we grow food, we need resources to grow it. We need land, we need transport, fuel for tractors, fuel for harvesting. We need fertilizers, we need water. We then have packaging, processing. We have delivery, transport of foods to places where we can buy that. So that actually delivers quite a wide range of environmental impacts. It's not just about greenhouse gases, but there's a lot of other things that negative effects that food has on the environment. So if we look in more detail at that, let's bring out some examples. Now, transport leads to impacts in delivery of food. So when we get the articulated trucks coming to Sainsbury's and Waitrose and everywhere, then they have an impact. But we think about what happens downstream of that. If we're wasting food, throwing it away, we put it into a bin. That's usually collected by an inefficient large refuse collection vehicle. They can contribute to traffic congestion, they can contribute emissions, most of those are diesels, and all of that transport for food waste contributes to largely pollutants that go to the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere is really, really efficient at redistributing pollutants. The same goes for landfill. So if we put food waste into landfill sites, then that produces gases. It produces methane. We have smells. So those go out into the atmosphere and can get blown around and distributed broadly in the environment. From landfills as well, we also get leachate. So this is the liquid residues from materials in landfills. That can also travel quite easily through aquatic ecosystems if it's released into the atmosphere. So next, if we think about the kind of things that are impacted, then we have a huge amount of resource that goes into producing food. So if we look at just the UK and the water used to produce the food that we waste, so this is only on the food that we could have eaten but didn't eat in the UK alone, We have 5 billion cubic meters of water that was used to produce food that we didn't eat. I can't visualize what 5 billion cubic meters of water looks like, but I think we'd all agree it's a lot. Now, the other resources that go into production of food are also lost if we waste food. So if we grow cabbage, a lettuce, potatoes or anything, then we use land to do that. We use fertilizers, probably pesticides, the fuel for the tractors and such like that I talked about a moment ago, transporting those goods, packaging, processing, storing them somewhere, keeping them cool. So all of those things generate impacts. So when we throw away food that we could have eaten but didn't, we're wasting the input of all of those resources. And if we look in further detail as well, then that costs us money. In April of this year, there was a new estimate of the amount of money that we spend on what's called forgotten food, things that people bought and didn't get around to eating. So an average family, for all of you listening at home, if you're an average family, you probably waste about £800 a year just on food that you bought and forgot about eating. We scale this up to the UK level, that's around £13 billion per year of food that was bought but didn't get eaten. So it's a massive economic cost to these things. Now, that's not all though. So if we move on to the next slide, over to you, Dianna.
Thanks, Pete. So my area of interest is not just food waste, but then the impact of it in terms of households, and especially thinking about food insecurity. As a lot of us know, food insecurity in the UK is increasingly becoming more of a problem. And as we see the cost of living crisis hit, we're going to hear more and more about it. We know that from estimates, about 8% of the population in the UK are currently food insecure, which means they don't have enough food to eat by going to somewhere like Tesco, Sainsbury's, wherever it might be, and picking up their shopping for the week. Instead, they're having to turn to options like food aid, such as food banks, which you've probably heard about quite a bit more recently. So this is an issue because what we also know is that a lot of food we produce doesn't actually reach people. So you can see the data here is about 30 to 50% of food that's produced doesn't actually reach a human stomach. And that's quite a shocking fact, isn't it? We think about all this food that's in production, that's available and ready to be eaten, but isn't reaching people who need it most. Overall, there's about 90 million tons of food wasted each year across Europe. And that's for the 27 member EU states. So that's a shocking statistic, really. We're facing a situation where a huge amount of inputs go into food production, not to mention human time and effort. And yet we see that a lot of food is being wasted at the same time that we have higher than ever rates of food insecurity in households. So how much food is that here in the UK? About 16 million tons of food waste is produced per year in the UK. And what we can do about that is think about this half. This half of food waste is generated by households. People like us who left an avocado too long or put it too close to a bunch of bananas and then don't know what to do with a bunch of very brown bananas. So some of the work that Pete and I do, and as you'll hear from Fatima and Gracie, is really looking at this and thinking about how we can make some changes to reduce this. And that's what we want to focus on. So as geographers and environmental scientists, we talk a lot about all of the challenges we face. But then we want to think about what are the ways we can address this. And so we want you to go back to Mintimia now, and I'm going to put it back up in just a moment. And I want you to reflect and think about in your home, which food gets thrown away most often. Let me just advance the slide here. We can see as we go. So question here is around fresh fruit and veg, drinks, bakery, full meals, dairy and eggs, fresh fruit or meat and fish. So of those options, if you go onto Mentimeter, you should be able to see the different choices available to you, hopefully. Maybe I'll slide this over so you can still see it, and then I'll put it back on and we start to see some words popping up. So think about the different foods that you find are wasted most often in your house. And could I just ask Gracie and Fatima, what do you, in your reflection, Fatima first, what food do you think is wasted most in your household?
I think in my household, it's probably, well, at university, I'd probably say it's bread, especially because, well, if I share it with someone, then it's okay. But at home, it doesn't get wasted so much because there's a lot of us to eat it. At home, I would say it's probably fruit, just stuff that we, it's in the fridge, maybe my mum's bought and we just haven't got around to eating it.
What about you, Gracie? What do you think ends up in the bin most often?
I would say both at home and at university, probably fresh vegetables. People often buy too many to get through in the week, and I just see them in the food bin all the time, both at home and at university.
I would have to say probably in our household, although we try desperately not to waste things, salad is one of the things that goes off most often. But here's a top tip that might help you that I was shared with Pete not too long ago at another event, is if you have a bagged salad of some sort, so it's spinach or salad leaves, whatever it might be, put a piece of kitchen paper in there before you put it back in the fridge, and that absorbs a lot of the excess water, which makes the leaves go slimy otherwise. So maybe that will help with that particular outcome. So we've got a lot of answers coming in here. We can see bakeries are quite big. So we've done a word cloud this time to see a really interesting visual of what are the things that we're hearing from you that you say you're wasting, you see wasted most often. Dairy and eggs is up there, but definitely bakery, a lot of fruit and veg salad, absolutely. Sauces, some really interesting results here. Drinks as well. I think milk is one of the things that comes up quite frequently in the data. So let's have a flip back over to, thank you for sharing your information. It's really good to see that. Let's have a look and see what the data shows. That's the interesting one, isn't it? So what do we know? Go back to Mentimeter, and here's what we've got. Overall, as you can see here, the overwhelming favorite, unfortunately, is fresh vegetables and salad. Now, let's think about the nutritional content of different foods. And of course, if we're facing a situation of food insecurity and perhaps poor quality food for some households, what we don't want to be losing is all the wonderful nutrients and quality foods such as fresh vegetables and salad. But yet that is the data that we see, is that 28% is fresh veg and salad, followed by drinks like milk and juice and things like this, and then baked goods, bread. Goodness, I mean, how easy is it to waste bread? You just don't think about it and it goes off very quickly. But again, we'll pick up on some ideas of what you can do to address that. And what's interesting is to look further down the list, and what we see is that where things tail off is around meat and fish specifically. It's interesting that fresh fruit is wasted less often. I wonder if that's because there's so many wonderful recipes out there for banana bread or banana ice cream or other ways to use up those poor brown bruised bananas. But what is really interesting to us is this kind of category where we see the protein items like meat and fish wasted less than the fresh vegetables and salad. So I'm going to hand back over to Pete now to pick up on why do we waste food?
Okay, so there's actually a very, very wide range of things that we've identified, but these are the three that are probably the most important for the UK context. So first one, not used in time. So things that people bought and didn't eat before they went off. So very often the forgotten foods, the things that you bought and then you put in the fridge or your larder and just didn't get around to eating. Personal preference is another big one. So the choices that we make about particularly the parts of food that we eat. So if we think about pizzas, for example, I'll not ask you all this question because you can't answer, but how many people here don't eat pizza crusts or bread crusts? Things like the skins of potatoes. My daughter doesn't eat the skins of potatoes, but they're actually very nutritional. So that personal preference for things that you do like and you don't like makes a big difference in generating food waste. Third one on the list is getting too much ready. So this is all about portion control. So if you don't get the portions right, then you don't match what you're cooking, what you're preparing with your appetite, your level of hunger, and then you end up leaving things that you've actually prepared to eat. So if we look at the economic value of that, we can see how important those are. So these are estimates of the value of wasted food in the UK, just the UK. So things that people don't use in time cost UK householders nearly £6 billion. So that's £5.7 billion that people spend on this food that they don't eat. Same again with the personal preference. So this is about the choice, things that you don't like, things you do like, the parts that you leave behind. 3.9 billion. And portion control, not getting the portions right, is responsible for UK householders spending £3.5 billion on food that they don't eat. So this has got a really big impact, and particularly when you scale that up to the UK level. Now, if we're going to do something about this, then the aims and principles are actually already established. What we have here is what we call a food waste hierarchy. So this is an extension of a general principle for waste and resource management. What you see here is a sequence of things that we should try and do. If we look at the environmental benefits of different things that we can do, then if we can reduce waste at source, that has the highest benefit. If we go down through that list, then landfilling or incineration isn't really preferred because it gives us very, very little benefit and also has negative environmental impacts. So for food, what we try and do is cascade down this list and try and get as high as possible in that triangle. So if we can't reduce at source, let's try and feed people who are hungry. If the food's not available or suitable for feeding people, let's feed animals. If it's not available for food, but not suitable for feeding animals, then let's try and use some of the materials in that for industrial processes. And as a second to last resort, can we compost it? Can we make some kind of soil improver to give us benefit from that? So we'll go through some of the ideas here and give some illustrations of that. So if we look first at reducing the source, now prevention or avoidance of wasting food is top of the list. So in simple terms, when we buy something, we should intend to eat it and we should actually eat it. That's not complicated, but it's something that we're not managing to achieve. At the same time, we need to think about the value of other parts of food. So if we think about orange peels or banana skins, for example, not many people eat them. They're not really palatable. They don't taste nice. But they do have value because we can use that organic material to do something positive and create other products from that. Now, if we can't reduce at source, where do we go next? Now, over to Dianna for this, because this is one big part. If we go down through the waste hierarchy, then feeding hungry people is the second preferred choice.
Absolutely. So again, this is something we've heard a lot more about recently. We know that a lot of food, which is deemed to be surplus food, that would be waste food otherwise, is going from supermarkets through a charity, frequently here in the UK, called Fair Share, and redistributed. So they talk about redistributing food, which would be waste food, that is being rescued from going straight to landfill or compost and being sent to other options like food banks, food pantries, a whole host of different organizations that are supporting food aid. So getting food to people where it's needed most rather than going straight to the landfill. So food donations, one really interesting option. And from a food insecurity perspective, it sounds like a really nice alternative. And I won't get into the contentious nature of what it means to take surplus food and use it to feed people who can't buy food otherwise, but I would acknowledge it definitely it is a way to address food waste. Another example is that in French supermarkets, it's now illegal to throw away or destroy edible food. So if you think about it, here in the UK, we have kind of the yellow sticker food. Every evening, you can go into a shop and get something quite cheaply, potentially, or you can use different apps like Too Good To Go or other options like this and rescue food, which would go to landfill otherwise. So there's some new things that are coming on, and it certainly is a better alternative than we see elsewhere. The other options are things like animal feed. So there's a wonderful initiative, or there was a few years ago, pre-pandemic, called the pig idea you might have seen, which was about taking waste food, feeding pigs, and then eating the pigs. Now, for vegetarians, that may not be so palatable. However, the idea is quite interesting. So what if the food can't be used by people going further down the hierarchy, let's use it for animal feed. And then, again, returning to this idea of the circular economy, the ideal option would be to use this feed for animals that are being reared for food. So it's really important to consider some things like this as an alternative. And then finally, another thing we can do is industrial use. So there are some really good organizations taking food which would be considered waste otherwise and using them elsewhere. So two examples here. One is called Back to Roots, based in California in the US, which charges local cafes a little fee to collect coffee grounds. Now think of how many coffee grounds there must be from all the cafes, from all of us who love coffee. And what do you do with this? In this case, using it for soil improvement for mushroom growing. So a really interesting way of bringing it back into the food cycle. And Dianna in France is taking the acid whey that's a byproduct of their yogurt production, which is being repurposed and used in baby food production. So some really interesting initiatives that are out there. looking into this. Now, I wanted to just take a moment to pose the question to Fatima, who's our sustainability officer for the union, and find out what kind of things are happening from the university perspective at the student union to address food waste. I think there's been some really interesting developments recently. So maybe Fatima, you could explain a few of those.
Yeah, so the student union is looking at different ways and ways we can prevent food waste. And one of the things that we've introduced recently, which is the Too Good to Go app that Dianna mentioned just a moment ago. So this has been introduced in the Susu shops, so this is where students go to get meal deals and so on. They've been partnered with the Too Good to Go app, so that at the end of the day, if there's any sort of like leftover sandwiches that haven't been sold, people can buy it, or like local students or people around the area can buy it through the Too Good to Go app. And essentially they buy a goodie bag buy it for £3.99, and it has food that it has a retail value of £10. So this is good because it obviously saves costs for Susu. Students and locals are able to buy food at a more affordable price, and of course this is food that otherwise would have gone to waste. The second thing that Susu have been doing is their zero waste refillables. So essentially sort of like a wall with sort of pots where you can go in with a reusable sort of plastic container or paper bag and put in how much pasta you need, how much lentils you need, and having loose products such as bananas and oranges. So if you know you want like a few bananas, but you don't usually eat the whole pack of like 5, 6, 7 that you get in the supermarket, it's good that you can just go into the shop and just buy what you need. So we've introduced a few initiatives like that to ensure that people are just getting what they need rather than going into sort of like Tesco sort of mindlessly and just, you know, I'm craving this and you just get whatever. So yeah, looking to ways to reduce that for students. So yeah, over to you, Dianna.
Thanks. We're going to go back to Pete now, who's going to pick up on what we can do, the big picture, and looking at composting and anaerobic digestion.
Yeah, I just love the idea of going mindlessly into Tesco's. Yeah, composting and anaerobic digestion. If you can't do any of the things we've already looked at, then this offers you a chance to get value from the organic matter. So anaerobic digestion is basically allowing the material to decompose in an oxygen-free environment. Now that produces two good products: biogas, so that's methane, and organic matter. So you can actually produce a fuel through anaerobic digestion. So this is a way of taking unwanted materials from food waste and creating a fuel. The remainder is used as a soil improver, so it's rich in nutrients and organic material, and that can also be used in agricultural settings as well. So again, we've got this kind of circular economy approach where we take food residues and use them to produce more food. Now, there is a limit to this. Composting and anaerobic digestion are both highly regulated, mainly because of animal waste byproducts. So if we look at the materials that you get from cows, for example, then there is a risk to human health if we don't treat those properly and make sure that they're adequately sterilised. We can't do that. Where do we go? What else can we do? Now, another way of getting value from food waste is to burn it, preferably to generate power. So if any of you are from Southampton, you might have seen the Marchwood incinerator. That burns people's rubbish and generates power. So you can use food waste as a fuel. It's not really as good as composting or anaerobic digestion because you destroy the material by burning it. You're left with ash and heat rather than organic matter and fuel, so not as good as anaerobic digestion. There is a big problem as well with using food waste because there's a high water content in food waste, and as most of you probably discovered, burning wet things doesn't really work very well. So what tends to happen in incinerators is that people mix together wetter waste such as food waste with drier materials, so the overall moisture content is reduced and it burns better. If we can't incinerate, what do we do? Now, the last place, the last resort, is really landfill. So burying this in a hole in the ground and leaving it. Now, across Europe, we've set out specifically to reduce the amount of biodegradable waste, such as food waste from landfills, because this generates methane and that can generate problems. So there is an overall ambition to try and reduce biodegradable waste. We didn't hit the 2020 target that's listed there. Methane generation can be a positive. If you can capture the methane, you can use it as a fuel. If you can't, then you have the risk of potential explosion. But if we think about putting food that we could have eaten into a landfill, quite simply, it's a lost resource. Did you buy that lettuce to fill a landfill? The answer is no. So all of the energy and effort, the resources consumed, have not been capitalized upon. So we've got some ideas there. What can we do? Some positive actions to make a difference.
Thanks, Pete. That's been a really good series of things that we try and do before it gets to this point. But how do we address this before we have food waste entering our system? So the key reasons that we see problems occurring and food waste happening is that often things aren't used in time. So how do we deal with that? And I've already given you the first answer here, which is plan ahead. How many times have you heard about meal planning? And it doesn't need to be complicated. It can be as simple as what we do in my house, which is back of the envelope plan for what are we going to eat this week. And one of the good things you can do is leave a leftover day in there as well, because you probably cook a bit more than you need. And you might end up with a strange meal occasionally of odds and ends, but you know, call it fusion food. It's okay. So plan ahead and embrace the meal planning. Shopping list goes on next, doesn't it? Because it sounds obvious again, but how often have we wandered aimlessly into Tesco and thought, what do I fancy tonight? And how many times we come out with pasta and pesto, and you go home and you've got another jar of pesto and another bag of pasta. Obviously, other supermarkets exist beyond Tesco. We just tend to think about that quite strongly. So shopping list, plan ahead, and then make a list that goes along with it. It's interesting to see how often this can be automated, actually, if you use online shopping as well, where it says, would you like to add things from your last week's basket? Just to make your life that bit easier. And then also thinking about, what do these different dates mean? What do use by, best before dates or best until dates mean? And how many of us have spices in the cupboard that are at least 5 years beyond whatever the date might be? Exactly. I was thinking about this just earlier this week at a food pantry, and we were commenting on how we have things like, I've got a jar of whole nutmegs, because how often do you use whole nutmegs, right? From 2015. Now, they're not going to cause me any damage because you only use a small grating of it. You just might have to use more of it. Oftentimes with spices, that's what you tend to see, is they lose their flavor. But other organizations are going away from using the use by dates where it's not necessary. So trying to get people to go back to using common sense and sniffing things if you can. Or maybe you're like me and got COVID and can't smell anything anymore. But ideally, we can do things around this like our families did previously, and just explore our options in a different way, rather than sticking very firmly to the use by, best before, and display until. Because if something says display until, it's still edible past that date. If it says best before, it's still edible past that date. Whereas the use by date is probably the most crucial one, especially for items which could possibly cause you harm, like meat, dairy, and so on when it goes off. So that's the first thing we can do, is thinking about how we address this issue of not using stuff in time and all the food waste that results from simply not planning well and not using things in time. And it's also understanding this best before date. Pete and I did a talk in a display at our Science and Engineering Open Day, and we had people recommending things they could do differently. And one of them had some really scathing comments about best before dates on water and salt. Ironic, things have been in the ground for this many years and suddenly you get it and it's 6 months out of date. How does this happen? It's a good question, and one that we very much enjoyed asking ourselves. I'm going to hand over to Pete now to pick up on the next one, which is personal preference and what we do about personal preferences.
Okay, so first one we can do for personal preference is buy what you like. This is not rocket science. If there's something that you don't like and you don't eat all of it, then think of an alternative. This can be quite subtle. So the example I used before of things like pizza crusts. If you don't like pizza crusts, you can either stop eating pizza, or you can buy pizza that makes crusts attractive. Stuffed crusts, cheese stuffed crusts, they're a really, really good way of getting people to eat the whole pizza. Probably not brilliant for health because you've got a lot of saturated fats, but you can do different things. So the next thing we can do, change our behavior. A good example of this, think of when we eat something like an apple. Most of the apple is edible. So we have a choice of eating most of it or some of it. So some people like me will only leave the stalk and the pips. That's it, I eat everything else. Other people, you'll see a whole apple and there's just a little tiny ring that have nibbled around the edge. And that's a really inefficient thing to do. So can we change that? If we recognise that that's a big problem where we're not utilising the apple fully or properly, if we recognise that, we can maybe do something different. And we have other choices as well. So, Dianna, cooking, preparing or serving too much, what can we do for that?
Well, we've already seen that one of the things that might surprise you is the impact of rice compared to other types of carbohydrates. But how often do we waste carbohydrates? It's certainly something I've been guilty of. I think one of the take-home messages from that is please don't waste food in the first place. But if you're going to, don't waste rice especially. There's been a whole lot of inputs going into that. So one of the things we think about as well is just how can you reduce waste from cooking, preparing or serving too much? It kind of goes back to the first point, which is buy what you need. So try and stick with what you need. Don't overbuy. Again, don't end up with 6 bags of different shaped pasta like I have. Can't you just make do with one? Weigh your ingredients. Again, that's a real issue with portion control. I think we're all guilty of portion control issues as well. So understand what a portion is and what it looks like, and weigh your ingredients as you're cooking so you're not preparing too much, which then leaves you with leftovers, which you may or may not eat, depending on your personal preferences. And that's the last bit, which is using your leftovers. Love Food, Hate Waste is a fantastic website for using leftovers as well, and ideas of repurposing things like mashed potato into bubble and squeak, and other things you may not have considered before. So there's lots of different things you can do in this space to make a difference as an individual. And now I'm going to head to Pete to tell you about making a difference at a global scale.
Now, the interesting thing about this and the important part is that global scale problems sometimes have local scale answers. So this is something that we can all contribute to. Now, this is so important that one of the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations has set, Goal 2, to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, promote sustainable agriculture. So there's a whole package of things that we're trying to do to make things better with regard to food, its quality, its production, and our access to food. Now, if we think about this just in very, very simple terms, we don't eat about a third of the food that we make to eat. Okay, so we're only eating approximately 2/3 at best. If we were able to utilize that to 33% of food that we don't eat, that is actually the same as having a 50% increase in food supply. So there's a question there about using the food that we already produce better. We live in a world where there's malnourishment and hunger, and in a world where we are eating only 2/3 at best of the food that we produce to eat. Now, of course, it's not that simple, because distribution and access are real issues here. There are big problems. The distribution of food and the availability is inequitable. So if you go into detail with the Sustainable Development Goals, there are ideas there about promoting and enhancing local food production so that people are close to where it's produced and can have better access to that. If we look at the other relevant goal, which is goal number 13, climate change. We all know about this. Now, this is possibly the most urgent part of all of the Sustainable Development Goals. So taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Now, we've already seen with some good illustrations that the food that we buy, the food that we produce, the food that we have access to has impacts. The big thing here is that if we're not consuming food that has consumed resources and had environmental impacts, then all of those resources and impacts give us no benefit. So as a starting point, the more food that we can eat, then the better use we make of the impacts. There's some simple answers to this as well. So seasonal and local. If we choose to eat locally grown and seasonal food as individuals, then we can reduce the impacts of transport and processing and so forth. Growing your own thing makes a big difference. And as we've illustrated as well, we can make individual choices about what we eat. So this is not a campaign against eating rice, but maybe eating less rice, eating more potatoes, thinking about where things have come from, looking at the labels on the food that you buy. If you've got a choice of different apples, is there an opportunity to buy something that was grown and produced in Kent rather than in South Africa? We can make decisions about that with simple information that's readily available to us and easy to understand. So there's things that we can do. Now we'll finish up with this by looking at things that are taking place. So we'll hand over to Gracie. Hello, Gracie, who's going to talk about something that's happening here at Southampton University, which I think is wonderful and brilliant and aligns with the kind of things that we've been talking about for the rest of this webinar. Gracie, over to you.
Nice. Hiya, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the things that us as students are doing at the University of Southampton. So first of all, BioCycle is an original project set up by students at the University of Southampton to combat food waste in our area. So basically what they do is they cycle around the Greater Southampton area to student households, and they collect our food waste, and then this food waste goes to local allotments who use the waste for composting and support their local businesses. If I can go on to the next slide. So I'm actually part of an organisation called Anaxis Southampton, and this is a collection of like-minded individuals with the united passion of tackling social, environmental and economic problems in local and international communities. So we've actually been improving the lives of people for people and our planet since 2007 at Southampton. And in the last 2 years alone, we have helped directly improve the lives of 260 people through a buy one, give one scheme that we set up with Brew, one of our projects. This used surplus food from supermarkets and gave them to disadvantaged families in the pandemic over the past 2 years. But today I'm going to be discussing with you one of our newest projects called Seeds for Thought, which I run. This project was inspired in 2019 when we built a 300-metre square hydroponic system in India for our international project, Project Millen. This project sought to combat the worsening effects of climate change on crop yields, whilst economically empowering the farmers in India. However, with COVID-19, access to this system was prohibited, so we wanted to make an impact locally. So in the UK, we identified that there was a critical need to support those who had lost access to free school meals during the pandemic. So we recognised the opportunity to use the same technology that we had developed in India to grow fruit and vegetables on our university campus. And so 9 months ago, Seeds for Thought was started here. Using the pre-existing ponds in our Geography and Environmental Science building, we have begun constructing a hydroponic prototype system. Hydroponics is the process of growing plants in water without the use of soil. The plants are cultivated on floating rafts where the roots are submerged in water, allowing for the direct uptake of nutrients. A key advantage of hydroponics is that it uses 90% less water and enables 5 times more produce to be grown in the same area than traditional agricultural practices. Our business model is centred around a buy one, give one scheme, where we sell half of the produce to our university shop in Susu, and we match that same amount and give it to disadvantaged families at our partner schools. This means that we can help the most disadvantaged families in our local area by providing them with fresh fruit and vegetables for free. Furthermore, our system is supported by the Solent NHS, who help schools to achieve the Healthy High Five Award. This award has 5 achievable elements, which encourages children to grow their own fruit and veg. So we are going to be organising school trips to our system so that the children can learn how to grow their own food, more about sustainability and alternative farming methods. We've also partnered up with Situ Catering, a charitable company in our local area, who supports families who rely on free school meals. And we are going to be creating a recipe book in collaboration with them, which teaches children and their families how to use food that we are going to be growing for them in a way that reduces food waste. So yeah, that about sums it up.
That's fantastic, Gracie. I think it's also worth mentioning how far have you achieved with Seeds for Thought? You placed quite highly in the national and international competitions for this particular project, haven't you, with Anaxis?
Yeah, we just competed in nationals for the past 2 years, and we got to the finals. So Anaxis is a global social enterprise. So there are how many countries? About 40 countries involved in Anaxis, and then there are 68 teams in the UK. And last year we were the first team in the UK, and we won for this project and Future Brew, and we went to World Cup where we placed 3rd. And this year we got to the finals with this project solely, and we got into the top 5. So yeah, we've done really well with this project, and that's enabled us to get funding to expand our future plans and make sure we can impact more people.
And what's the new name of Future Brew? Is it Immediate Beer?
Yeah, it is immediate. Yeah,
And you can buy it, can't you?
Yeah, you can buy it online. You can look up their website if you type it in.
Fantastic, thank you. That brings us to the end of our formal presentation. So if there's any questions, we're happy to answer them. Again, you've got me and Pete Shaw here as representatives of members of staff here at the university in geography and environmental science. And we've got Gracie and Fatima as some excellent ambassadors for our school and for university more broadly, who are doing some really exciting things in the area of food insecurity and food waste here in Southampton. Hopefully it gives you an idea of the kind of things you can do. We were also going to be joined by another student today who is the president of Anaxis and another geography student. Our geography students certainly do well in Anaxis and are a key aspect of that, but she's interviewing for a role in corporate social responsibility rather, for a large multinational organization. So she couldn't join us. So you've got us instead. But again, we're happy to answer any questions. I'll have a quick look in the chat and see if there's anything available. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because you've looked at a plate long enough. And see if we have any questions. We've got one. So is the fact that foods like bread and pasta are so cheap a factor in why they can get wasted more easily? I would say a resounding yes, but I think I'll let Pete answer this one, as this is definitely his area of expertise. So Pete, what do you think? Is it about being cheap?
I think it's partly about being cheap. The short answer is yes, probably. There's a longer answer here, and I think it's actually related quite closely to the amount of money that we spend on our food. If you cast your mind back to the dim, dark, distant days between the First and the Second World War, it was very typical that a family would maybe spend 30 to 35% of their income on food. At the moment, although things might be changing, that tends to be nearer to 8 to 10%. So the amount of our money that we spend on food proportionally has crashed enormously. So the cost of food is a big factor. If you go back to that list of the foods that are commonly thrown away, then think about protein items being right at the bottom of that list. So most people don't throw away a lot of fish and meat. If we think of the cost of fish and meat, that's generally much higher than the cost of fruit and vegetables. So vegetables in particular, seasonal and local ones, are really quite cheap. Bread and pasta are cheap as well. Now, I think for bread, one of the issues is that it doesn't tend to have a long shelf life. So particularly at this time of year, if you put a loaf of bread in your kitchen and don't eat it for 3 or 4 days, it's probably going to go a little bit moldy or stale. So bread, short shelf life. Pasta, cheap, but it's also durable. So dry pasta will last for a very, very long time. But very often with pasta, people report that it's portion control. So measuring out, weighing the amount of pasta that we need, putting too much on our plates. So there's quite a lot of different factors there. The economics is certainly an important part of that. And the longevity and the way that we actually portion food, I think, are also mixed in with that.
Pete, we'll stay with you for the next question as well, which is, has globalization increased food waste? And then after you answer that, can you go on to say what students do after an environmental science degree, just for two for one?
Oh, you're making me work really hard, aren't you? Globalization, I would say yes. This brings into play an important aspect of the way that we lose food. Because what we focused on here is a lot on what we call food waste, which is the food that doesn't get eaten at the consumer end. So basically, after it arrives at the shop and the role that the retail sector and householders play, that's food waste. We have food losses as well, which are generally the food that we lose between where it's produced and reaching the supermarket. So if we think about globalization and food waste, and particularly perishable foods, so if, for example, we were going to buy fruit from South Africa, it's got to travel a long way. So we have losses during transits. Every time you move things, fruit gets bruised, you have to maintain temperature, and it's aging for every hour that it spends in an aeroplane or on a ship. So the food losses increase through globalization. And also there's an aspect here about globalization that it's changed our diet. So if we think about those examples of greenhouse gases, we get a lot more greenhouse gases from rice, but that's not something that was historically eaten in large quantities in Northern Europe. It has to be imported because we can't grow it here. So those food choices lead to those impacts. If you look at fruit and vegetables, then one of the worst offenders for greenhouse gases is the avocado. So we grow our avocados in different places, and transport, growth, land use and everything else makes a really, really big impact. So they're quite a kind of an impactful form of fruit. Do you want to come in on that, Dianna? And I'll just say a couple of words about the jobs as well. Environmental science and geography, for the environmental science side, there's no typical graduate destination, but I can tell you that the vast majority of our graduates use their degree. So typically around 4 out of 5 of our graduates work in the environmental sector. That could be in NGOs, it could be in regulatory bodies, Natural England, Environment Agency, private consultancy. We've had an advisor to senior government officials. There's a very, very wide range of jobs. But the big picture here is that people see this as a stepping stone into a career in the environment. Any comments on geography, Dianna, from graduate perspectives?
So I've added a little bit in here already. We see a lot of students going into consultancy. So geography is one of those wonderfully open degrees. You can do a lot of things with it. What we're seeing that's really popular over the last few years has been sustainability consultancy. Again, corporate social responsibility. Geographers are a natural fit for this because the skills you come out with a geography degree in environmental science is the ability to bring information together and share it effectively with people in a range of different ways, whether it's making a map and mapping data, or bringing together qualitative data from interviews and explaining what the impact of that might be. And that also leads into other areas where a lot of geographers work, which is policy. So looking at local policy, national policy, policy advisors. We've got graduates who've gone to work for DEFRA and other organizations. We also, unsurprisingly, have a lot of people who go to work for Ordnance Survey. I mean, where else would a geographer go? But again, the range of skills there and the range of jobs are not just making maps and doing some geographic information systems. It can be a whole host of other areas, including marketing. So marketing is another area we've seen more students going into as well. There's just a range of opportunities available. I've also put a few things in here. Data analysis is quite popular if you're interested in numbers and quantitative analysis. We've got a lot of students who go into work in the public sector, such as local authorities, and work in jobs there, whether it's in public health, or data analysis or something else entirely. So a lot of different areas really to look into. It's a very employable degree. I think that's the key thing that we see is a lot of students go straight to the workplace. And a lot of students also go to transport planning, I should add. But transport planning, again, is not necessarily sitting behind a computer and making out a plan for where the next train line should go. It's also going out and talking to people about what would be feasible and realistic with the local area. The next question I can see here is, do you think demographics influence the amount of food wasted by individual households? That is an excellent question. As a matter of fact, there's a PhD student who's exploring this topic that is co-supervised by Pete and me and Hampshire County Council. And she's just completed a very amazing data collection of 94 households across Hampshire to find out what people waste. They sent her photos of food waste. And one of the questions we are currently finding out is there an influence demographic in terms of what type of food is wasted, whether it's avoidable food waste like pizza crust that Pete talked about or potato peels, or is it unavoidable food waste, and does it seem to change? Does it vary rather by demographics such as household education, income, household size? So yes is the short answer, we think so. And we're looking at that closely locally, but Pete can tell you a bit more about the larger data sets because it's something you've looked at more extensively, especially here in Hampshire, but also more broadly. So Pete, do demographics influence the amount of food wasted by individual households? What do you think?
Yes, they do. this is interesting because it's hard to find anyone who doesn't waste food, but the surveys that there have been don't always come out with the same observations. So the things that we do suspect are happening is that young working people are producing more food waste than other groups. So typically people are working between the ages of, say, 16 and 34. So busy people, lots to do, busy lifestyles. The time is a real issue for people at that life stage. What we do know is that, as a very, very broad generalization, households with high income waste more food. We also know that large households waste less food per person than small households. So if you've got a family of 5 or 6 people, you don't see a lot of food waste coming out. If there's people by themselves, or maybe 2 or 3, then the per capita waste tends to be higher. And people with school-aged children as well. So this, again, it's a sweeping generalization, but as a very, very general pattern, families with younger children waste more food. But there are exceptions within this. So within different demographic groups, there's a wide range of behaviours and a wide range of food waste generated.
I think it's challenging, isn't it? Because we also try to teach children not to just clear their plate out of necessity. So there's this tension between public health messaging around making sure people don't overeat, and also not wanting to waste food, or at least that's one of the issues in my household. The next question was, do you cover food waste in environmental science? Oh, do we? But again, this is more Pete's area, so I'm going to let him answer that in more detail. And then the next question that we can both pick up on is, are there large misconceptions about when food is not safe to eat? Good question. So first of all, Pete, tell us how you cover food waste in the environmental science degree. I think Fatima might be able to contribute to this as well, having done one of the modules.
Yeah, we have a module in our 3rd year called Sustainable Resource Management. So food waste is one of a series of issues about sustainable resource management, waste, recycling, reuse, and so forth that we cover. And Fatima, you did that, didn't you? I'll come back in a moment. And also in projects. So we have a final year project. Quite a few of our students choose to focus on food waste in that project. So they design their own ideas, they carry out their own research with help, guidance and assistance from a tutor. So we've had a number of projects on food waste, and mainly food waste avoidance in the last few years. Fatima, you've done my module, haven't you? How good was it?
Yeah, I did the Sustainable Resource Management module last semester, and I definitely can say, obviously, I'm coming towards my end of my degree, it was one of the most eye-opening modules that I've done. Obviously, it covers things like food waste, but not just food waste, things like e-waste, recycling, reduce, and the sort of waste hierarchy that we were talking about. And yeah, it definitely made me think about products in a different way. So all sorts of everyday products that I buy, and the sustainability of them, what I could be doing better. And I was just saying to Pete earlier that a lot of the statistics I was sharing with either like my friends or my family, like, you know, this, and seeing if I could perhaps, well, I guess change their mind about something, or let them know about, again, things about recycling that we think we're doing correctly, but a lot of the times when you actually learn about it, it's, oh, that's actually not recyclable, I'm putting in the recycling, and then it leads to everything that put into recycling being sort of contaminated. So just things like that. I think this module was really useful. And obviously the statistics about food waste as well was something that I covered in that module too.
Right. Excellent. We're nearly out of time, so I can answer one question really quickly. The question about misconceptions of food safety. The answer is really what Dianna said about the date. So use by, sell by, best before. A lot of people don't understand those. The sniff test is generally reliable, but as you get older, then your senses start to become less sensitive. So that is an issue, but it's all about the dates, really.
I'm happy to answer the next question about lower income households buying more ready meals and similar foods. So there's been some interesting research done in both the US and the UK to look at the food purchasing behavior. There's these wonderful large national data sets called the National Diet Nutrition Survey and the Family Expenditure Survey here in the UK. I love data sets and I love national surveys. And in each of these, what we see is that typically lower income households get more nutritional bang for the buck if you look at what kind of food they tend to be buying. Also, the issue with a lot of ultra processed foods, which tend to be cheaper and nutritionally not so strong, are that actually they don't go off so quickly. So the food waste is not so much of an issue there. With my kind of perspective of food insecurity and what households face who are experiencing food insecurity, frequently it's not an issue around meal planning or inability to cook. It's also around storage and issues of having enough space for storage. So if you think about some of the most food insecure households may end up in hostels or B&Bs temporarily where there's very little option in terms of storage or preparation. So I wouldn't necessarily say that lower income households buy ready meals because ready meals actually cost a lot more money. If you're on a tight budget, that's usually more about getting as much as you can for what's available. So I wouldn't say necessarily that they have this kind of different food quality in terms of purchasing more ready meals. There might be some more ultra processed foods because also children are more likely to eat them, so they're not going to waste the food. So it's an interesting and complex situation. It's really hard to make too many generalizations apart from we know that typically if people are on a low income, they do make more nutritious food choices with the money that's available for food, but there's less money available for food in terms of the disposable income, and we're seeing much more of that now. I don't see any more questions coming up now. I think we've got everything. Has anyone else spotted something I've missed? Well, I hope we've given you some things to think about. We certainly love talking about food waste, which is probably a bit strange, but hey, it's an interesting topic and it's certainly an important one. And it just highlights how a lot of the things that we're covering in environmental science and geography are these big questions and the sustainable development goals and the things that we must be addressing and doing. And so we've given you some examples. The students, Gracie and Fatima, have given you some wonderful examples of what's going on the student-led perspective at university. As I've mentioned, Pete and I both work in this space as well with local organizations such as local authorities and the charities to understand more about what we can do to improve the situation around food waste and food security, both which do go very closely aligned now. So I think these are important things to acknowledge that when you're working in this area, there's so much going on and geography and environmental science really are at the forefront. There's one more question that's come in now. Could a push towards plastic-free packaging in the future change the shelf life of most of our foods? That is a very good question. Fatima's nodding. So maybe Fatima, you'd like to pick up on that question if it's not putting you on the spot too much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was just going to mention that was something that's recently been introduced in the CC shop, especially with our refillables. I guess things like dry foods like pasta, rice and things like that doesn't necessarily need so much packaging. You could even just put it in a paper bag and you usually will be okay. Things like fresh foods, that's obviously a bit more of an issue in terms of whether they can go off or not. But I think we're seeing a trend of supermarkets and again in the sushi shop having loose food, and again that can help with things like portion control, and then obviously fruits have oranges have like a natural, I guess, protection that we can utilize instead of wrapping around in a plastic paper. So I definitely think going plastic free could help with, and we're seeing that in supermarkets and in the shop here.
Thank you, Fatima. I think we are probably at the end of our webinar now. We could add our contact details, and if you have any questions to follow up with, that would be fantastic. We'd be more than happy to hear from you. So Pete and I will put our emails in the chat there for you, and you'll have a way to get in touch with us. So we're also both admissions tutors for geography and environmental science, as well as being passionate about food waste. So if you're interested in understanding more about studying at university, and especially at Southampton, we're happy to tell you more about that. Or if you're interested in food waste, please get in touch. It's something we can talk about quite a lot. It was hard to constrain ourselves to an hour-long webinar. So we're going to put our contact details in the chat. Otherwise, I really appreciate your time today. I'm sure my colleagues would like to say thank you as well. Yep.
Yeah, thanks to all for coming. Some great questions as well.
So just putting my email in, and Pete, hopefully you can do that as well. Got it. Great. Fantastic. So thank you all very much for your time today. I hope you enjoyed as much as we did and got to enjoy the fun of using Minty and see how well that worked online. And hey, it did. Great. And very good knowledge about the carbon impact of different foods. So enjoy your evening. I'm off to have some homemade pizza, and I have to say I will eat the crust tonight. So thanks very much and good to see you. Take care and bye.
Bye for now. Take care.